Hello and welcome to this TOK presentation about assumptions. The structure of the presentation will be as follows, and let's dive straight into the real life situation. The real life situation under consideration is the terrorist attack on the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris on January 7, 2015, by the Islamic fundamentalists Said and Sherif Kouachi. This horrific act of violence shook the world and perplexed human beings like you and me, as we wondered what could possibly drive a human being to such macabre ambitions. These acts appeared to be irrational and only capable of being perpetrated by psychologically deranged individuals, but one can make an argument that they are in fact completely rational. They merely hold assumptions that are radically different from ours. If one is truly convinced that Western culture embodies prostitution and vice, as ISIS puts it, and if one is truly convinced of the pleasures of martyrdom and that drawing Muhammad is a desecration to the creator of the universe, that infidels deserve to die, etc., etc., it is a heroic act to break into those offices and murder those cartoonists. Looking at the real life situation from this angle, we arrive at the following knowledge question. To what extent do the assumptions we make affect the conclusions we arrive at? In the context of this question, what is meant with assumption is a thing or idea that is taken to be true or certain, even though there is no adequate proof for it. One limitation one faces when attempting to answer this question is that the author of the response themselves has assumptions and presuppositions that will influence the conclusion he arrives at. Reason as a way of knowing is also limited by assumptions due to the very nature of what reasoning is. To reason, one must first have assumptions, and if one wants to reasonably examine the validity of their assumptions, they will again need another set of assumptions to initiate that reasoning process. So, assuming that assumptions or premises are a prerequisite to reasoning, it becomes evident that at some point an individual's assumptions must be founded on something other than reason. Mathematics is often presented as an art that champions reason, where emotional baggage and other assumptions have no bearing on the truth of a mathematical statement. However, even mathematics has been plagued with the task of validating the axioms it rests on. Most of mathematics boils down to saying if x, then y, and axioms are just assumptions we make regarding a mathematical system so that we can derive useful theorems from them. In other words, axioms are the x. Numerous mathematicians and logicians have devoted much of their lives to this business of laying a solid foundation to mathematics. Bertrand Russell, Alfred Whitehead, David Hilbert, Gottlob Frege, Kurt Gödel, just to name a few. The Peano axioms, which attempt to formalize the properties of natural numbers, is an example of these systems that mathematicians create. However, while some mathematicians were confident that they could find a foundation for mathematics, Kurt Gödel demoralized many of them when he published his incompleteness theorems. These were theorems of mathematical logic that establish innate limitations of virtually all axiomatic systems. The first incompleteness theorem states that in any consistent formal system F, within which a certain amount of arithmetic can be carried out, there are statements of the language F which can neither be proved nor disproved in F. According to the second incompleteness theorem, which is an extension of the first one, it just states that no system can demonstrate its own inconsistency. Euclidean geometry is another example of an axiomatic system where one can see that depending on how the axioms are defined, the results of mathematical work can vastly differ. One of the 5 axioms of Euclidean geometry is that given any line L and any point P not on L, there's a unique line through P that does not intersect L. This is pretty congruous with what we experience in our everyday lives, but is an assumption nevertheless. One could also assume that there are no lines through P that don't intersect L, or that there are infinitely many. These axioms would be no less valid than the established one, they would just lead to different geometries. You could end up with geometries where the internal angles of a triangle must always be greater than 180 degrees. It's just a matter of defining your axioms. So here we can see that with the incompleteness theorem and with how you can manipulate axioms to give you different results, these things put a real dent in the idea of mathematics being free of assumptions and purely a craft of reasoning. To explore the knowledge question in a slightly less abstract manner and with some concepts that are perhaps more related to our everyday lives, ethics is a very useful area of knowledge. In ethics, the assumptions we must make are the ethical standards that we believe people should follow. These ethical assumptions have a huge bearing on what we view as right or wrong and what laws we implement. Going back to the Hebdo attack and how, from the point of view of the terrorists, the attack is ethically valid, this is an example of moral relativism. Meta-ethical moral relativism is based on the belief that there is no objective right or wrong. Things are merely a matter of perspective. This is certainly a plausible ideology, but in practice, having no assumptions about what is right or wrong leads to a dysfunctional society because normative moral relativism, which is when you tolerate others' actions due to your belief in moral relativism, would give everyone a free license to do whatever they felt was right. So, whatever they wanted, basically. And at surface, a reasonable way to establish an ethical code is an ideology called utilitarianism, which is a form of consequentialism. Basically, the idea is to enact that action which results in the most aggregate happiness, which is the sum of every individual's benefits from that action minus the harm done. However, it is entirely self-defeating to try and calculate the consequences of one's actions to such an extent, and even if we all had perfect knowledge about the utility of our actions, many of us would still stray from the most utilitarian path for entirely selfish reasons. Deontology, which is a duty-bound moral system where the goodness of an action is based on that action's adherence to a certain set of rules, seems to be too general and also suffers the problem that the bias of the person determining the deontological framework may clash with that which other people deem to be right or wrong. It is here that I will suggest that in ethics, emotion can be a very powerful way of knowing and a good way to determine the assumptions we operate under in an ethical context. As fallible as human emotions are, empathy or empathetic behavior often lays a good baseline for what actions lead to humans in general coexisting together happily. Take the golden rule, treat others like you want to be treated. This maxim of benevolence has been found in almost every culture and religion on earth, suggesting that human beings are naturally empathetic. Rather than rationalizing why murder is wrong or why it may be wrong under a certain set of circumstances, it is much easier to simply apply the golden rule and realize that murdering that person you're really mad at is probably not the most morally robust course of action. In this way, emotions are a more pragmatic way of knowing for the everyday interactions we go through. But not only do the assumptions we make about morality affect our ethical conduct, but more general assumptions about the nature of the universe do too. Take, for example, the idea of free will. Many people believe that free will is entirely deterministic and that we basically cannot choose because the processes by which we make our decisions are not controlled by us. We are products of our environment, etc., etc. But many people do believe in free will. They do feel like they have a choice. So yeah, there is a conflict there and a very large debate. So at the University of British Columbia, they made a study where they made 15 students, well 30 students in total, and 50 students read a passage from Francis Crick's book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, where he basically reduced human consciousness, electrochemical processes in the brain, but the other 15 students read something in his book that had nothing to do with free will. And it turns out that those people that were exposed to the idea of this hard determinism or deterministic free will, these people were more likely to cheat on the test than those that were not exposed to the idea of free will being deterministic. So this led to the scholars that published the study saying, if exposure to deterministic messages increases the likelihood of unethical actions, then identifying approaches for insulating the public against this danger becomes imperative. So here we see how an idea just about how the universe works can potentially have great effects on how you act ethically. Because just because believing in that free will is deterministic doesn't necessarily mean that you can just go berserk and do whatever you want and disregard other people's feelings about your actions. But some people seem to think that if there's not a greater purpose in life, if we're not meant to something, there's no meaning, they can't accept the bleak view of the universe without somehow their world coming crashing together and the moral compass is being derailed, which is interesting. In conclusion, we have seen that assumptions largely dominate the way we think because all of our thoughts can be traced back to some elemental assumptions. However, they are also malleable and we need not be shackled by them. In the Middle Ages, we thought science was blasphemy. Now, scientists are respected as innovators and important members of society. The first democracies were fraught with slavery. We used to think that burning matter released phlogiston. Einstein revolutionized Newtonian physics, etc., etc. When assumptions are revolutionized, so are areas of knowledge, and that is the very nature of progress. I think that what we can see from this presentation is that true progress comes when someone questions the underlying assumptions that everyone else operates under and new discoveries are made. So, in a sense, we are slaves to assumptions because we do need them, but at the same time, we can examine ourselves and discard assumptions that are shown to no longer be valid or useful and adopt new ones with no fear. This answer implies that we should never let ourselves get too complacent, never take an assumption for granted, and hold no belief sacred. Don't try to rid yourself of your assumptions, but recognize what they are and how they influence your thought process. This is a path to critical thought and mutual understanding.